This is Terms of Reference. I'm your host, Stephen Laddick. It's no secret that we live in a truly connected world. I can speak from experience that it's possible to be online in every nook and cranny of the planet, from deep inside the Ugandan countryside, to the middle of war-torn Syria, to the Islands of Fiji in the South Pacific. The opportunity to connect to the net pretty much anywhere for whatever reason, it's business or social, and yes, even evil purposes, is here now. There are many consequences, externalities, and unknowns associated with this connected reality, some of which we are painfully aware of, like trolling, and some we don't even have the ability to imagine yet. For example, what happens when virtual reality becomes ubiquitous? One of the things we know is that every time you use your mobile phone, swipe a credit card, surf the internet, or basically any other activity that involves passing digital information across the internet, you leave a small, unique breadcrumb or fingerprint behind. If you were to capture and review these breadcrumbs for one individual across any length of time, you would have the ability to learn an astonishing amount about them. If we perform this exercise across communities and whole populations who generate what we now call big data, the learning and insights can be profound. Today's guest on the 109th episode of the Terms of Reference podcast is Emmanuel Letouzé. And Emmanuel has dedicated his career to thinking about how big data can be used to help those most in need. He is the director and co-founder of Data Pop Alliance, a visiting scholar at MIT's Media Lab, a fellow at the Harvard Humanitarian Initiative, a research associate at ODI, and a non-resident advisor at the International Peace Institute. Emmanuel is the author of the UN Global Pulse's white paper called Big Data for Development, Challenges and Opportunities, where he worked as a senior development economist in 2011 and 12, and the lead author of the report Big Data for Conflict Prevention, and of the 2013 and 2014 OECD Fragile States Report. He's also a regular speaker on big data and development issues. From 2006 to 2009, he worked for UNDP in New York, including the Human Development Report research team. From 2000 to 2004, he worked in Hanoi, Vietnam for the French Ministry of Finance as a technical assistant on public finance and official statistics. And as you'll also hear us discuss towards the end of the interview, Emmanuel is also a political cartoonist. I spoke with him in New York. Hello, Emmanuel. Thank you so much for being on the Terms of Reference podcast today.
Hello, how are you? It's my pleasure.
I am well, thank you. Where do we find you sitting today?
So I'm sitting in New York at ThoughtWorks, which is our home in the city. So ThoughtWorks is a consulting company that graciously hosts us in New York.
Fantastic. I love that's part of the new economy, right? So is ThoughtWorks, are they in like an open office space, or is it just another organization that hosts Data Pop Alliance within it?
It's not a co-working space. It's a company, and I was invited a couple of years ago to give a talk here, and I found the office and the people to be really nice. So I just asked them when I set up Data Pop Alliance if they could host us, or if they could, if they did these sort of things, and they just agreed to have us here. And since then we've grown from being just me to being about 7-8 now. So it's been a really, really great collaboration with them.
Super cool. Well, you've given us the smallest of introductions, but you direct an organization called Data Pop Alliance. You founded it. Why don't you tell us about what it is, what you do, what your goals are, and why it's important? So I've been working for the past, let's say, like 15 years in development, and I got increasingly interested in data. So my background is I'm an economist, development economist, demographer by training. So I've always worked on data and development, and I grew increasingly interested in big data around 2010. And then sort of like fast forwarding 2013, I decided to create something on big data and development that would have a sort of academic feel, that would do capacity building and training, and also research and so like policy engagement, and that was not really existing at the time. So I basically pulled together my network. So the sort of the people I had been working with for the past couple of years. I mean, prior to 2013, including people at Harvard, at MIT, and at the Overseas Development Institute, and that was the starting point. So we really sort of
launched in 2014. So Data Pop Alliance is, in a nutshell, I mean, the way I talk about it, is as a joint initiative of the Harvard Humanitarian Initiative, MIT Media Lab, and Overseas Development Institute, so ODI in the UK. And our goal, focus, and mandate are to promote, so I'm quoting, a people-centered big data revolution. And so we do that through collaborative research, training and capacity building, and advocacy and policy work. It's important because big data is this like new-ish big thing.
I was just going to say, big data is kind of new, kind of not new. I guess, most of the people listening to this podcast will have heard of big data. It's been, if it's on CNN, it's kind of old news, right? But why is big data important? Why making it people-centered? Why is that important?
Yes, I mean, there have been these discussions. So my take on it is that, I wrote, and I still say that big data applied to development work and policy making is still in its operational and intellectual infancy. So by that I mean that I think we know very little, and we understand very little about how and how much this new ecosystem that arises from big data is going to essentially change the world. And so there is still some skepticism about the novelty of it, the significance. Some people do claim that we, quote unquote, have been working with large data sets for a very long time, so therefore that there's nothing really new about big data, that it's another techno hype, that we heard the same thing about the internet changing the world, etc. But I mean, one thing that I also tend to reply is that, well, the internet has changed the world in the sense that the world would be significantly different today without the internet. I mean, when we're not connected to the internet for an hour, most of us just lose our mind.
More than lose our minds. Let's be clear. People go crazy.
Yeah. So it's not to say that it's a silver bullet, or it's not to say that big data is going to reduce poverty or solve easily some of the world's long-standing historical challenges. But I think there's definitely something extremely powerful. But it also comes with great risks and challenges. I mean, so when we talk about the great risks or challenges of big data, most people, rightly so, have in mind the sort of ethical challenges, privacy risks, kind of surveillance, Big Brother, etc. And these are real challenges, and these are real risks. I mean, I think the revelations of Edward Snowden were a game changer, and it's an eye opener for a lot of people about the extent to which governments could actually use big data as a large scale surveillance, or to support a large scale surveillance apparatus. We have, for instance, one of our research affiliates who published a book recently called Weapons of Math Destruction, Kathy O'Neill, where she talks about actually the rise of surveillance activities, threats to individual privacy, the algorithmic decision making and its biases, and how it can actually entrench inequalities in power dynamics, etc. So these sort of go beyond the privacy risks. And I think what is very interesting with big data is whether and how it's going to either challenge existing power dynamics and decision-making structures, or whether it's going to entrench them. And I think right now, if we had to make an assessment as of today, it's more the latter. And it's pretty standard with technology and with new social technical phenomenon. It is the people that have the power to use them that use them first. And therefore, it's mostly big companies, it's big governments, it's surveillance agencies, etc. So the notion of promoting a people-centered big data revolution is to try and speed up the diffusion and democratization processes. And this has been the case throughout history. At some point, these innovations trickle down, they diffuse. The same thing happened with printing and writing, and so it led to mass literacy, for instance. But our main goal is to try and avoid that big data be only used by the powerful, and to speed up the process by which people can actually benefit from it.
You've circled back, and I'm glad you sort of brought that whole conversation back to institutionalization of big data and the fact that, sure, that organizations that have resources are usually the first movers on and can use it, but you want to bring those benefits of big data down to what you would, the individual, the population. Give me some practical examples of the types of work that you're doing right now, and are there things that are trickling out? Is it research? Is it working groups? Is it tangible projects that you're working on right now that are having effect?
Yeah, first of all, estimating the effect you have is very, very hard. So I guess,
of course, sure.
The best we can do is to do our best. Mm-hmm. So in terms of the general thinking is our focus is for instance to foster data literacy. And one of the first things that we sort of did was to really unpack and try to understand what data literacy meant and entailed. And actually, so it goes back to the initial discussion or the topic that we just discussed. A lot of people see data literacy, and it's also becoming one of those new buzzwords. Everybody wants people to be data literate, etc. But when we ask people what they mean by data literacy, a lot of them would say something like, "Oh, it's the ability to use data, etc." But I think, and we think that it's not a very satisfactory definition or conceptualization of data literacy, because in some cases, for instance, being data literate means not using data, or it means, for instance, it could be refusing to use some data sets because they have been collected in such and such a way without people's actual consent, etc. So concretely, we are developing a series of professional training programs for national statistical officers, for policymakers, for also journalists. And we're going to develop and deploy these trainings in 5-6 countries over the next 2 years. So Colombia, Senegal, Rwanda, Kenya, and Thailand, plus some in the US. And so these workshops are informed by this conceptualization of data literacy that goes beyond, that includes, but goes beyond only providing technical skills. So these are going to be 3-day workshops. They will touch on the main tools, the main concepts of big data. So first of all, what is big data, where it's coming from, how novel is it, et cetera, et cetera. Then also providing technical skills. So we're going to have hands-on. So there are hands-on sessions and group work using R and Python and looking at machine learning techniques, et cetera, et cetera. But we also look at the history of data. So what has data actually done historically for spurring democracy and development around the world. And also we're looking at the political economy of data and big data, ethical considerations and challenges. So in other words, we don't just want people to come out of those workshops with technical skills. We want them to be able to shape the future of data and big data. So to also question these power dynamics.
What I'm thinking of right now while you were making that explanation was, how problematic is the word data for you? Because right now you're talking about big data, you're talking about large, sort of already a term that's very nebulous to most people. And then what you were just describing is interfacing with National Statistics Office, people who are, usually fairly comfortable dealing with data. They understand that. As we talk about other people, we have this problem, at least in the United States, where it's really common for people to make a joke about how they don't get math or science, right? Mm-hmm. But if you said to them, if somebody were to come into a party and they were to say, "Oh, hey, but I can't read," ha, 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 right? That would just be completely unacceptable, right? So we still have this sort of social norm, at least in the United States and other parts of the world, where being data illiterate or being science illiterate is sort of socially acceptable. So this brings me back to my question is, when you're trying to engage on a population level or on a ground level with these things, are you getting outside the statistics office, or is your work going to focus mostly on those people who already get it?
Yes, we will definitely, and we definitely work outside of so official or national statistical offices and systems. And the question of what data is actually a fascinating one.
Yeah, because I mean, people are using data all the time, right? I mean, your body is collecting data. You know, as you sit there, as people are listening to this. I mean, the sound is data. So that's why I was kind of wondering how problematic that is for you.
It's actually one of the best entry points to get people interested and excited about big data is actually to show, to argue that in a sense everything can be said to be data. Yeah, so the sound we emit, the words we speak, what we write, even what we see. I mean, colors are data. I mean, they are. If you look at the definition of data, it's actually indeed pretty nebulous. I mean, it's like, sets of facts that would be a pretty good, pretty good definition of data. And then you have those subsets of data. So what we in the development sector industry refer to as statistics are usually official statistics. So they are a subset of data that have certain features. They have been produced by statistical systems according to some standards and norms, so the fundamental principles of official statistics, etc. But they're just a subset of data. And then there are structured versus unstructured data, and each of those come with different features and characteristics. But I think fundamentally what is sort of like a game changer is that big data as data. So what most people think and talk about big data as data are those like passively emitted data streams that are the byproduct of our daily lives as we interact with digital devices and services. So it's obviously our digital
fingerprint, footprint, whatever you're saying. Yeah.
Yeah, so the digital breadcrumbs or the trails of data that we leave behind. So Sandy Pentland, our academic director at MIT, refers to the bulk of those as indeed these digital breadcrumbs. So credit card transactions, cell phone data, and also cookies, and then there are video cameras that capture footages of especially urban life, satellite imagery, and of course the whole everything on the web. So, and these are mostly unstructured data. So, yeah, pictures, films, et cetera, et cetera. So, what is really, I think, as I said, is like a game changer is that historically statistics were collected by official bodies, and actually statistics comes from the German science of the state. So, and statistics as a public industry is about roughly 200 to 250 years old, and it was about collecting data for the intended purposes of policy making, counting the number of people and counting the stocks of grains and other assets, and increasingly over time it has changed to including information about societies. But still, these were pretty tightly controlled processes through surveys and censuses and also administrative records, etc. So the thing with big data is that now they are passively emitted data, and they're data, very, very granular data about people. And I think this is really where the greatest political opportunity and also risks come in, is that now we are able to know a lot about human societies as ecosystems at a very, very fine level of temporal and geographic granularity. And also these are connected data sets. So that opens huge new horizons for policy and science. But also there is this the pitfalls, which are that indeed we can track people, and also it can be extremely extractive. It can be a process by which the NSA or the Amazons of the world indeed know a lot about people, and then run algorithms and understand and send them leaflets or ads without these people actually being really part of the process.
Give me a tangible example. I think you guys recently did a workshop or a talk or something on health data. Can you connect it to a particular subset like health or another topic like that about how this can tangibly be used either to set policy or to make changes like that?
So I think a good case that was discussed recently and that a debate we were involved in is the case of Ebola. So there was so after the outburst of the Ebola epidemic in West Africa, so last year, so especially in Guinea, Liberia, and Sierra Leone, a lot of people in our community asked for the cell phone data from these countries to be made available to researchers and the responders to basically do contact tracing, mobility analysis, know where people were, and of course the argument was that this would help curb the spread of the disease. There were also voices that said, well, no, this is actually extremely risky. These are highly volatile political environments. So Sierra Leone, Liberia having had decades or 2 or more decades of civil wars until recently. And the argument was not very clear as to how exactly crunching these cell phone data, so known as call detail records, would actually be, like operationally, how you would actually turn that into action on the ground. So, long story short, in the end, no one had access to these data for legal reasons, political reasons, commercial reasons, ethical reasons. But I think that the question now is, what about next time? So what we're working on right now is a project called OPAL, which stands for Open Algorithm, with Orange, MIT, and the World Economic Forum, where we are trying to sort of build the next generation of systems to access these so-called big data sets that are collected and stored on the servers of these companies, especially telecom operators, but in a way that is safe, such that the data does not leave the servers, but also that is like stable and sustainable in the sense that these data will not be only available to selected teams or researchers based on personal connections or others. We want to build a systemic approach to analyzing big data streams collected by large companies and especially telecom operators. So the end will be, or the end product will be a platform where national statistical offices, but also civil society organizations, ministries, cities can send queries to these data sets. For instance, we want to do maps of population density in real time. We could also study the changes in the prevalence of poverty based on the number and volumes of calls made by the people in these data sets. And so there are different applications. And what is very interesting about this project is that this will be done in collaboration with partners, institutional, official and non-official in these developing countries, also researchers, to develop the algorithms, to set up the right legal standards and frameworks, and also to train researchers and users on using the platform, and more broadly on being more data literate. So I think that it is a concrete project that is being developed right now, which I think has really huge potential.
Who funds this? Is it the companies like Orange and MIT, or I guess MIT is an educational institution, but is this a pot of funding that you have to sort of find these projects and make them a reality, or are you going out and you're seeking the funding and it's very discrete and specific to this? And then second of all, where would this platform sit? Is it something that you're hosting, or is that then hosted by Orange or who?
In general, and it's actually an interesting discussion or question, what is the future of funding of the development industry?
I feel like that's an entire podcast series in itself.
Yes, it is. Yes, it is definitely. because we do see the rise of these really big actors of of course that hold data. So Facebook being the sort of probably the stereotypical example, or Google, and everybody's asking, oh, how can we get money from Google or Facebook? And some do, but most don't. But anyway, so for a project like Opal or our training activities. So far, it's been fairly traditional donors that support these projects. So large U.S.-based philanthropic organizations, governments, so aid agencies. In the case of Opal, it was so we've received seed funding from the French Development Agency for our training programs. It's been so it's supported by the Hewlett Foundation. So these are and Opal is also being supported by the World Bank. So these are the kinds of funders that we have relied on, so like traditionally, and that we are relying on. But then there's indeed the question of what about other kinds of funding? What about how could one really tap into private sector funding with all the perception and actual risks of being seen as having to actually
having to be complicit with them, right? I mean, you're on the same side as them if you accept their funding, I guess.
Yeah, but I mean, in a sense, it's the same. It's the same thing with donor funding.
Sure. Mm-hmm.
And I think I've been in this in this, let's say, I use the term industry. I mean, it is a sort of industry. So I've been
Absolutely.
in this. Mm-hmm. I've been in this development industry for so about 15 years, and so I worked for the UN for about half of that time, and I decided to leave the UN for different reasons, including what a lot of people say about the UN, that it's and I have a lot of respect for the UN and my former and current UN colleagues, etc. But it's indeed not a system that where innovation and agility, etc., are valued for a number of reasons. But there's also this notion that governments at the UN, that is in part of the culture, that governments are almost by nature good and well intended. At least people who work on development issues at the UN. Of course, if you work for the Department of Political Affairs, it's a very different culture. But when you work in the development space at the UN, so you have to say that governments are your main clients. So from governments from the global south, governments from the global north are your main funders. So you're sort of stuck having to think in terms of, we are here to serve governments who are well-meaning and well-intended, and they have all agreed to the Sustainable Development Goals, and we are going to support them to monitor the Sustainable Development Goals. And this is very closely related to the issue of data and big data, where in this sort of line of thinking, which is almost a sort of it's a theory of change, or it's a theory of the world. What is needed is better data in the hands of governments and policymakers to make better decisions, which assumes that the main problem with the world is that governments don't have enough data. And I do think that evidence-based policymaking, etc., goes a long way, and I do think that data in general can do a lot to improve public policies, but I don't think that the reason why the world is so poor, or that such a high proportion of the world population is so poor, and that there is such massive inequality, environmental degradation, etc., is due to a lack of data, primarily. Especially in the hands of governments.
So tell me about, you're sitting here, we're recording this in May of 2016. You've been around for a couple of years and you're growing and you have some specific initiatives. What does life look like 5 years from now? You're not the only big data players out there. I mean, you've got you and Global Pulse up the street from you. You've got a friend of mine who owns a company called Junior. They do big data stuff for public data in the government sphere. What do you think is going to happen in 5 years? How do things look different? Do we have public access to it, or How does it work for you?
Yeah, so I mean, I guess there are two sets of connected questions there. One is how I see the future of the space. So the space being big data and development or big data and policy, and especially what I would think is desirable versus not desirable. So that would be one, and then the other is where I see us as Data Pop Alliance being, and what role we could play. So I guess just to start with the second one and trying to shed light on the first one in the process. My hope is that, I mean, first of all, my hope is that we will still be around, so as Data Pop Alliance in 5 years. So we are relatively young and actually also pretty complex organization because we are like a multi-partner organizations. So as I said, we started these 3 founding institutions, so HHI, MIT, Media Lab, and ODI, and then we were joined recently by a 4th core member, so the Flowminder Foundation. So this is just to say that, yeah, it's obviously a lot of work. It's very much still a sort of like a startup culture, and I'd like us to keep that. But at the same time, if or as we grow, then yeah, there are other constraints that come up. What I would like us to, the role that I would like us to play is really, I would say, like twofold, or the distinctive features. One, to keep this sort of academic feel, which few actors have or can legitimately claim to have. So yeah, to rely on the not just the brand but also the values of Harvard and MIT and our other academic partners within Data Pop Alliance, and I think that's extremely important. And the second is also is to keep as much as possible working with local actors. We're working on a series of like living labs as part of regional data spaces in the main developing regions of the world. So to have this strong local anchor, including but not exclusively with governments. And I talked about the sort of the constraints of that I felt working at the UN, is that essentially there are things you cannot talk about. It's very hard to talk about corruption. It's very hard to talk about just bad governments. And I want us to be able to talk about those things, and also to talk about the politics of data, ownership and control of data, etc. So that, in a sense, leads me to the first question, which is, the sort of what could what could big data look like in 5 years? What would be desirable developments and features of the space in the next 5 years? The sort of bottom line is that I think it has to be a systemic evolution, meaning there are lots of actors that are at play. So there are, as I said, governments, civil society organizations, and just citizens and users of these digital services, etc. Also academia, also of course the private sector. So it's only the early years of figuring out how this ecosystem of actors in what I call the sort of the big data ecosystem or the big data community are going to sort of work together. Still, a lot of governments, including national statistical offices, want to access the data. So they want to access data, what they call private sector data. Right now, it's not very clear always who actually owns these data. It's not very clear who are going to be the owners of these data in 5 or 10 years. And we're actually, I think, shifting towards a model where what really matters is who controls the use of the data. And I think ultimately it has to be, and I hope it will be, the actual emitters of the data. So, and this is where the politics come in, and this is where the very complex political economy implications come in, is that I think increasingly, so citizen users will need to have a greater say in how and for what and by whom these data are being used. I think private companies will, for the foreseeable future, continue to be the sort of the guardian or the steward of these data, but I think increasingly, or this is what we're pushing for, they should not be seen as the sort of sole owner and controller of the data. So there are lots of things that need to be put in place for these sort of like mental and actual policy and also technological changes to happen. But that's clearly something that I think would be part of the desirable future of big data, where there is a stronger discussion on the use of data and where non-governmental and non-private sector actors can actually weigh in on the modalities of the use of this data.
While I'm listening to this, I'm looking forward to taking part in some of your working groups in the future, whatever. We obviously can't dive in much deeper on that particular aspect, but just how does this demand that we evolve our governance systems as we think about who owns this data and whatnot? Fascinating topics. My next question for you is, you talked about Edward Snowden at the beginning of the show. My question is, what's the biggest disruption that you've seen in big data in the past 2 or 3 years? Is it Edward Snowden? Is it some other kind of WikiLeaks person? Or is it some small tool that you've seen, or just some shift in people's thinking?
Yeah, it's a very tough question.
I mean, you started this organization because you felt there was a need in this space. So you're being a disruptor yourself right now, but was there another impetus or something else that's happened over the last 2 or 3 years where you're like, it's, now there's movement, or it set us back, or something like that?
Well, so one thing that I said a couple of years ago when I actually started Data Pop Alliance was that I really wanted to focus as much on the implications of big data as on the applications of big data. And it sounds like, just a sort of like a linguistic trick, but the distinction between applications of big data and implications of big data, I think that distinction remains relevant and important. And I think over time, people started getting what the difference was and why it actually mattered. So in the early years of big data, I would say 2010 at least applied to development and policy. So 2010, 2013, it was all about, how can we use these data to do X, Y, and Z? And it was always the same examples that were thrown around and used, mobility analysis and traffic and how to improve bus routes and early warning of epidemics, so Google flu trend, et cetera, et cetera. And it's only, I will say, in the past 2 years that issues around, more deeply political issues around ownership, control of the data, whether and how people could actually be incentivized and empowered to care about what was done with their data. So this notion of data literacy, all the sort of ethical, political facets of the question really started to gain greater attention than in the early years. So we've sort of we've shifted from a model where, this is a great tool, and we who have the resources to use the tool are going to use it for the greater good, etc., to something that is actually to realizing that it's actually something that is much more disruptive, to the point where it's unclear, if we look 50 years ahead, whether, for instance, representative governments are going to be the norm or the exception. I mean, if we look around today, we are in May 2016. If we look at even the sort of richest, most developed democracies, around there, I mean, democracy is not doing really well. The representative democracy is not doing very well. That's pretty scary. And so the question is, how can data revive the democratic and political ideals that sort of underpin representative democracy? So we see the emergence of the quantified self movement, where people track how much they eat, how much they run, walk, or etc. There's also a movement towards quantified communities. Is this the future? Is the future one where neighborhoods or big cities, for instance, are the sort of the main governance institutions and levels? That's a pretty big question. Others say, is it going to be around topics? Are people going to coalesce around people who care about climate, who care about environment, who care about poverty, who care? And I think these are really, really profound and complex questions. But I think we have to think in those terms. Like, what could the future look like? Because history is unfolding at a very fast pace, and I think there are a lot of the old institutions and decision-making processes and systems that are being and will increasingly be challenged by data.
So how does this work at Data Pop Alliance? You've mentioned a couple of times how you are a conglomeration of organizations, or you're an organization of organizations. How do you guys get work done? Do you, as you lead the charge, how does a new idea bubble up, or how does a new focus area bubble up, and then how do you guys come to consensus on what you'll work on?
So usually, we have a group of about 6 or 7 members of our executive committee. So people who represent MIT Media Lab, Harvard Humanitarian Initiative, ODI, and Flowminder, and I'm sort of like in the middle with our team here in New York. So the way it usually works is it's a combination of opportunistic considerations and strategic considerations. So we focus a lot on trying to develop these local activities and trying to build local ecosystems. So for instance, one pretty big focus of ours right now is in Bogota and Colombia, and then it's also Senegal and Dakar, etc. So essentially we work with local partners, and we try to see what really matters to them and what are the sort of topics that are high on their agenda, but it usually comes down to pretty much the same topic areas with different weights in these different regions. So issues around poverty and inequality are always pretty prominent. Conflict, crisis, social cohesion, stability and instability is also another set of questions that a lot of people care about. Urban dynamics, also related. And then it's really a matter of also finding out whether there are strong partners we can work with in these countries. And that sort of determines a lot of the actual major projects we work on. So, for instance, right now, we have a series of a set of big programs. So I mentioned OPAL earlier, which is sort of like a global open algorithm project. So that's going to be in a lot of these deployed in a lot of these countries. Another one is big data and inequality. For instance, so it's a work program that we are going to work on, especially in Latin America, so in Colombia and Mexico, so with a series of local partners. Another one is on big data and disability, which I think is a topic that is vastly under-researched and talked about. Also, big data and migration is also something we're going to work on. And last, I will mention, or two last areas are big data and climate change resilience, and also urban dynamics.
So just some small topics.
Yeah, just some small topics. Yeah. So, but I mean, on a daily basis, the nevralgic center of Data Pop Alliance is in New York here. And so we try to talk about what the priorities are, what the sort of opportunities for further collaborations are, and then I try to sort of filter, distill, make sense of this, and then I present sort of big program areas to the members of this executive committee of which I'm also a member, and we function by consensus. I mean we just talk. Mm-hmm. We have regular discussions, and it's actually I think something that I really enjoy, because it's a complex process. I mean, sometimes we don't agree. Each of these very large institutions have their own agendas, and so it's finding a compromise such that everybody in the end agrees and is happy with the overall direction. But more importantly, on the specifics of any given project. Yeah, but I think it comes with, in a sense, it comes with the territory. I wouldn't want to give that away. So that involves a lot of emails, a lot of calls, a lot of in-person meetings. It's all based on trust, on just a personal relationship that we have established over the years, and I'd like, as much as it forces me and the whole team to work very long hours. I think it's the most valuable way of working, because we can rely and draw on the resources and knowledge of these really great institutions. And I don't think it would be possible if we were just one organization. So if we became, for instance, just an NGO, it would make our life easier. But I really like this sort of distributed model or distributed network model, where we have to sort of pull the strings in different direction to make it move forward. So I very often describe my role as being a sort of a orchestra conductor, where I have to make sure that the music is like sort of nice. Yeah, and often I actually also get to sort of write the music, but I get feedback, and people have to like the music to play it well.
So at what point do these initiatives that you're putting forward? I'm thinking back again to the beginning of the conversation where you're talking about the trainings that you're putting forward for the National Statistics Offices, maybe some other projects you have. At what point do they become standard ops, or are there examples of things that you've worked on over the past couple of years that are just now sort of standard procedures or platforms that people use that they don't even realize they're using big data, or has that not quite happened yet?
Yeah, we're still a fairly young organization, even though all of us involved have been in this space for quite some time. Some of us even longer than others. I mean, someone like Sandy Pentland has been one of the most prominent figures of big data for almost as long as big data has existed. So some of his work, I would say, has become pretty standard, and also spin-offs from the MIT Media Lab. But of course, this is not, and this by no means can it be labeled or branded as something that Datapop has contributed to. So as an institution, I don't think we are yet at a stage where we can claim that we have, that anything we are producing or doing is becoming standard. I think maybe our approach and our thinking around the focus on people empowerment, etc., is sort of getting traction and being recognized as a sort of a bit of a trademark, if you will, and our focus on data literacy, for instance. I think if there are two sets of activities that I think, or two or three that I think will have a potential to actually becoming standard. One is our training program, so the data literacy training program, and this is a potentially very large scale program where we want to train professionals in developing countries. So as we talked about, national statistical officers, but also journalists, other quote unquote policymakers, civil society representatives, and so on and so forth. We are organizing our first large scale pilot at MIT Media Lab at the end of June with representatives from different, more than 10 countries coming. So these professional training workshops will hopefully in the next 12 months become one of those standard products reasonably hopeful and confident that it could be the case. And then we also want to work with academic institutions and research institutions to develop, for instance, a fellowship program. So this whole body of work around data literacy, I think, is something that could become pretty standard and a bit of our trademark in the next 1 to 2 years. I think Opal, as I mentioned, also has potential. So this open source platform and ecosystem to access and use data held by private companies could also become a sort of like standard, large scale standard operation. And then last, in terms of model, I think we have recognized that the real value is in really working locally, but in a systemic manner. So initially, I very much resisted the sort of like a lab model. So there are lots and lots of labs around the world. So data labs and innovation labs and whatever labs. So I really didn't want us to develop like data pipelines labs, so like anywhere. But at the same time, if you want to have actual meaningful operations, projects, partnerships in developing countries and so in cities, then you actually need to have like people like locally, like on the ground. So the way we've sort of reconciled these two sort of like opposite models of working, so not having anything labeled as a lab, but also having a strong presence, is that we're developing so what some have called living labs, which is we, for instance, as in Bogota, so we have a team of 3 people now, and we set up projects with different actors of this sort of like data ecosystem in Bogota and Colombia, which are like pretty large scale, long term, with the city, with the Chamber of Commerce, with private companies. So there are no like physical labs, but we try to establish long term collaborations with different actors, and we sort of label that as a living lab.
Excellent. 2 more questions for you before we close out our episode. Who do you pay attention to? Yeah, I mean, I know that you just said you got tons of emails and phone calls and whatnot with your executive committee, and I'm sure you're, the people with ThoughtWorks and whatnot, you're kind of in a collaborative environment. But are there blogs, personalities, big data people that you pay attention to at regular time? Like, where do you get your information from to sort of stay energized and informed?
I think there are 2 main sources. One is indeed our internal network. So indeed, it's not just the executive committee. I mean, I very much enjoy, talking regularly with Sandy Pentland, for instance, and he's been actually very involved and very supportive. So he's not just a big name that we've put on our website. I mean, we have regular contact with him. So talking to him is always also like a great source of information and inspiration and etc. Same thing for Patrick Vink at HHI, and of course they also bring their own. Like new sources of information, and sometimes we exchange emails about, have you seen this link or this article, or have you heard about this whatever conference, or et cetera, et cetera. But beyond that sort of like really core inner circle, there's also our network. So we have about 25 to 30 research affiliates, and so in different countries. So they are more academic in nature. So they also send us a lot of information, and it can be formally, informally, through the working groups, through just emails, or when we talk about specific projects, because a lot of these research affiliates are involved in actual research or training or advocacy projects. So we do get a lot of information from this network. For instance, as a case in point, right now we're working on a paper on urban dynamics in Bogota with Bruno Lepri and his team in Trento in Italy. So we talk twice or 3 times a week. We exchange emails, and so last week was the 100th anniversary of Jane Jacobs. I mean, of her birth, and so the urban theorist, the American urban theorist. We exchange a lot of emails about basically data and urban dynamics and Jane Jacobs, etc. So just as an example. And then on the team also, I mean, so we use Slack a lot. So we have lots of different channels, and one of them is interesting articles. Another is actually which is like a higher level, like links we like, and then we have this weekly. Bi-weekly links we like kind of series where we curate and push out a series of links that we and so therefore articles that we think are especially interesting. But I would just say that overall I think I don't have enough time, and unfortunately I should do more of let's say like more reading and like intelligence and gathering and just like I feel sometimes that I'm not, almost ironically, I'm not plugged enough into some of the current debates just because of purely because of it's like
because you're the founder of a small organization, right? The classic entrepreneurial problem.
So but hopefully as we grow, that problem will alleviate itself a little bit, although everybody tells me this will never happen.
It only happens if you make it happen, right? Last question I have for you is one that I ask everybody, and that's if you think outside of the big data world that you spend 24 hours a day a part of, and maybe not, and you could be inside this world as well. What's the, and this is just an opportunity to geek out for a second. Is there an innovation, especially for the development or humanitarian aid world, that you think is especially cool or especially sweet, especially interesting that, you've either just recently heard about or you think is up and coming that people should know about?
Besides the concepts or the projects that I mentioned, no, there isn't really anything that sort of like comes to mind. I would maybe just say that. So I also do, and because I don't know, you mentioned it's the opportunity to geek out, or
absolutely,
or to be a bit, I don't know, let's say like self-serving. Or I also do political cartooning, and I've done that for many years, and it's always been my second half or second.
Your stress reliever, probably.
Yeah, also. So, and increasingly I'm, and in the past when I was working, so for the French government, and they were like, when I was like 25 or even the UN, these were supposed to be two very distinct activities. There was like the serious one, which was my work as an economist or a development economist, etc., and then my activities or my hobby as a cartoonist. But it's always been pretty. It's always been political and social cartooning. So there was always a connection. And increasingly over the years, and I think even more so in the next few years, I would personally like to sort of merge those two activities more and more. So data visualizations, for instance, are sort of in this realm of where data meets art. And of course, there are very, very historically and right now like very prominent people who have used visualizations, actually very visually appealing techniques to convey information. Tufty and David McInnes, etc. So I think this is also the blending. A lot of big data is about the blending of disciplines. So from the social science and the hard science, but I think there will be an increasing role for art or the arts in general. So, for instance, the leader of LCD sound system, James Murphy. I think it was 2 years ago, did a song using tennis ball sounds from the U.S. Open. So he took the sound of like the
that's awesome,
and then turned that into a song. He also wanted to do something with the subway, the sound of when you swap your card on the subway in New York. He wanted to change the sound to so that it would make music, and then that didn't work because there are some regulations for people who can't see. So this sound has to be specific. So anyway, and then of course there's the whole like actual visual art. So people like Rahul Bhargava at MIT Media Lab have used graffitis in their work, etc. So for me, in terms of like the next step of social cultural innovation that will be spurred by and also foster sort of the development of big data is the blending of these different disciplines. And I think I would really like to use more of my cartooning to also explain what big data is and just also comment on big data through cartoons.
Emmanuel, thank you so much for the conversation today. It's been fascinating, and I look forward to following up with Data Pop Alliance in the near future.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the opportunity.
You've been listening to the Terms of Reference podcast from 8preneur.com. Subscribe to us on iTunes.